You had probably heard before Cheryl even mentioned it this morning that many UU congregations are talking about adding an eighth principle. Today I want to give you some background on what that's all about and how Tapestry will probably move forward with exploring it. I'm going to start just by getting the words out there. The eighth principle is a commitment to journeying toward spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. We're going to leave that up on the screen through the sermon so that you can refer back to it whenever you want. It will show up also probably in newsletters and some other printed resources from Tapestry. And before we get too far down this road, we need to make sure everyone's on the same page. Some of our newer folks might be wondering, what are these 7 principles that he's talking about? Well, they're basically a list of our core ideals and values. They're not dogma. They're not a list of what you must believe to be one of us. Rather, they're a list of concepts and aspirations that most of us connect with. Something that makes them a little unusual in the context of a faith tradition is that we've voted on these principles in a wide-scale democratic process together. They didn't come from a particular sacred text or an individual authority figure. We wrote and approved them together in a community. The more formal piece that a lot of you may not know is that the 7 principles are part of the bylaws of the Unitarian Universalist Association. They're included in Article 2 of the bylaws, to be specific, and Article 2 is being reviewed by UUs in a big, very long national conversation. In the spring, Casey, our intern minister, will lead a few sessions about that revision process in Article 2. It is possible that the 7 principles will be changed. If they are, much of that change will be to clarify our commitment to beloved community and anti-racist work. So please hear this. Even if the 7 principles are changed in a couple of years, the work that we do at Tapestry to understand and address the 8th principle will still be an important step in that direction. I know some of you are squirming and distracted by the idea of our principles getting revamped. That is important stuff, but it's not what we're talking about today. Today we have a beautifully written document that encapsulates our values. So sometime when you have a moment, I encourage you to sit down with our 7 principles and the real challenge that they present. Read them closely, and you can't help but see the care that was put into crafting them. If you need a list, I can find one for you, but really just Google it, and it is everywhere. It's on most churches' walls and orders of service. It's even in our hymnal. So that's the context of the document. I want to talk briefly about the historical context of race and Unitarian Universalism, all of which leads up to this moment. And I'm speaking in very broad overgeneralizations here, but I've only got 20 minutes. When liberal Christians first started identifying as Unitarians in America in the early 1800s, they were mostly New England, European American social elites. Speaking very generally, they often did not treat Native American peoples well. Many of them directly, financially benefited from slavery. And some were leaders in the eugenics movement, promoting birth control and sterilization for people of color because they were seen as inferior. Now, in the historical context, Unitarians were not exceptionally racist, but they were far from answering the call to justice, as we would like to imagine. In those days, many Unitarian and Universalist ministers and leaders did speak out against slavery. We often celebrate their efforts. They were brave and articulate leaders. The Reverend Theodore Parker, in particular, comes to mind with his direct influence on Abraham Lincoln's development and his own thoughts on the issue. What we sometimes ignore when we celebrate that history is that these great leaders did so at cost to their own careers, often causing significant conflict within the congregations that they led. As a budding denomination, Unitarianism did little to progress abolition collectively as a denomination. And there were some amazing, outspoken, brave individual leaders, but we didn't do it together as a community. Later, Unitarian Universalists did do a very good job during the Civil Rights Movement, largely at the request of Dr. King, and we should be very proud of that. We showed up in Selma in large numbers, and we engaged in all sorts of local efforts. However, within the denomination, a major fumble was about to take shape. In the late 1960s, a promising anti-racist agenda was supported by the UUA. Then it was defunded due to a financial crisis, leading to a terrible conflict, after which many, many African Americans left the UUA. Before that moment, we were on track to be making major progress toward a racially diverse community. Following that controversy, sometimes referred to as the Black Empowerment controversy, there was a long period of silence until the late 80s and early 90s. In the late 90s and early 2000s, another wave of progress came, but was followed by more regression. The UUA voted in 97 at General Assembly to commit to intentionally becoming an anti-racist, anti-oppressive, multicultural institution. But in the early 2000s, funding and support for much of the work began to decline. The regression culminated in the UUA president resigning over inclusivity and hiring issues. Today, I think we all know about the wider environment that we're in, about racist mass incarceration, police violence, of very scary Supreme Court decisions regarding voting rights and affirmative action, and elected officials openly supporting white supremacists. Shows us we are in a very dangerous spot. It is in this wider context of history, of progress and regression, and a very scary moment, that Blue, which is the Black Lives of Unitarian Universalists, wrote this eighth principle and asked congregations to consider embracing it. That's the context, the document, and the history. I want to talk a little bit about the content of it itself. First is this idea of a journey toward spiritual wholeness. Working to understand our own biases, addressing the barriers in our hearts, man, that is spiritual work. I imagine the people who worked really hard on the welcoming congregation process to embrace LGBT people, and particularly Sheila Raymond and Lauren Schmid come to mind. They will tell you it was not just about committee meetings and emails. Pausing to find the courage to address our own biases is soul work. It is hard, but it is incredibly growthful. The eighth principle is first about a spiritual journey toward wholeness for everyone. Second, the principle lifts up the goal of beloved community. It's no accident that this is our topic today. Beloved community is the term that Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. popularized. I sometimes hear it thrown around really casually, which makes me squirm a bit. Beloved community is an incredibly high goal. It arises when people with serious differences build transformative relationships. The Eighth Principle Project puts it this way. They say, beloved community happens when people of diverse racial, ethnic, educational, class, gender, abilities, sexual orientation, backgrounds, or identities come together in an interdependent relationship of love, mutual respect, and care that seeks to realize justice within the community and in the broader world. Beloved community isn't about one specific kind of difference. It's about people of all sorts of backgrounds understanding and celebrating their interdependence. It's realizing, as the Reverend Teresa Soto puts it, that all of us need all of us to make it. All of us need all of us to make it. And that is universalism through and through. Now, Dr. King used this word, beloved community, to describe the goal, the society that we were aiming to create. But like most nonviolent strategies, beloved community is both the goal for the wider world and the method that we have to use to get to that goal. It's being the change you want to see, as I'm sure you've heard said. Starting with ourselves in every relationship and conversation that we have. You see now why I squirm when people throw around beloved communities casually. In some of the conversations that I've heard about the eighth principle, the word that most often gets ignored, I think, is one of the most important. It's the word accountably. What does it mean for us to accountably dismantle systems of oppression? Accountability means having concrete goals and reporting your progress toward them to someone else. That may sound very familiar for your professional lives or athletic pursuits. When it comes to diversity and inclusion, though, the idea of accountability may make us start to squirm a little bit. But the idea is the same. It's impossible to know if we're making progress without some measurable goal. And to make meaningful progress, it's best to enlist the help of experts to help define our goals. Accountability isn't about punishment. Accountability is about forward growth. In terms of the eighth principle, accountability means that white Unitarian Universalists, or mostly white UU congregations, hold themselves accountable to communities of color. That could mean recognizing that people of color within Tapestry have an invaluable voice in this work. It could mean having a group of people of color among our neighboring congregations as a sounding board or someone to seek guidance from. This word accountability is one of the things that I appreciate most, kind of because I'm a lazy person sometimes. I am not an overworker. I do not understand that culture. I am not an autodidact. I don't just teach myself things. This is why I pursued a doctorate, because I needed a structure of a school to keep me learning and growing and deepening. Tapestry has the potential to make progress toward beloved community. And I think the eighth principle is a great structure for us to define some of that progress. So now for the $64,000 question, why single out racism? There are two reasons. One is that racism stands out as a historically heinous and enduring problem. Racism in the United States stems from chattel slavery, where people were uniquely legally treated as property that could be inherited. slavery, American Indian genocide, exploitation of immigrant Chinese labor shaped American history, and still its economy, and vast disparities persist. The other reason for naming racism is that Unitarian Universalism has actually done really well in other justice arenas. The majority of our ministers are women today. The LGBTQIA plus community is very well represented as members and ministers and staff and other leadership. The Welcoming Congregation program has been wildly effective. This 8th principle highlights racism, but it's not exclusive to it. I imagine that one of the best ways that it can influence our work at Tapestry is by helping us look more carefully at the intersections of those different oppressions. So I want to talk a little bit, as I mentioned, about what this might look like in particular for us moving forward. Our board has put together, or I should say is in the process of putting together, a racial justice task force. So far, Hannah Carey, Celia Young, Hiroshi Yamaguchi, and Amanda Wainwright will serve on that task force. A few other people are discerning if that role is right for them still. Soon, hopefully, the task force will bring a speaker from the Orange County Human Relations Council to lead us through a discussion of the particular history of race here in Orange County, and to chew on that a little bit. There will probably be some written materials for you to reflect on and some small group conversations. This isn't a one-way conversation. I know it is today because it's a sermon and that's the format that we have, but this will be a conversation. As part of accountability, at Tapestry we'll have regular reports to the congregation about the progress. And we may seek to partner with other organizations or people of color to work on that accountability. These efforts will all lay the groundwork for a congregational vote on the 8th principle at our annual meeting in June of 2024. June 2024 is a long ways away. Action will begin immediately, but we want to make sure we are prepared before we make this serious commitment. Diversity and inclusion looks different depending on the cultural context. For a variety of reasons, the national dialogue around race has been defined primarily as a black and white issue. Here in Orange County, as you know, the picture is very different. The percentage of black residents in Orange County hovers around 2%. That's a pretty small number. But don't think for a minute that Orange County is white. For roughly 20 years, the majority of residents in Orange County have been people of color. And before you start down the North Orange County, South Orange County road, our neighbors here in Lake Forest are 34% Latino and 22% Asian and Pacific Islander. We don't currently reflect our neighborhood. And using a black and white lens to understand the potential for this community is the wrong approach. At Tapestry, our exploration of the 8th principle will need to be kaleidoscopic, welcoming of diversity in all of the forms that it presents itself. I chose our story in the Time for All Ages today because it highlights, at least for me, how little I know, both about the local struggle for racial justice and about the broad array of ways racism shapes our world here. Embracing the 8th principle won't make it a singular focus of our life together. Tapestry didn't become a gay church when we went through the Welcoming Congregation program all those years ago. What it did do was take steps toward becoming a welcoming place where people could find a spiritual home and begin to feel comfortable as their whole self in a faith that makes sense to them. Us, I should say. That work isn't perfect, but it was and continues to be an important piece of our journey toward wholeness. The final thing I want to say is this is a change that I believe in. In 12-step circles, one of the sayings that I really appreciate is, nothing changes if nothing changes. Nothing changes if nothing changes. One of our most naive pieces of adult lives is the misperception that problems untangle themselves or that relationships magically improve on their own. We often think and hope that if we just keep on the current course, the next time we look, things will be better. But that fear-based denial is something that we are all victim to on occasion. But I think it especially applies to this situation. If nothing changes, then nothing changes with regard to building multicultural, diverse, beloved community. And sinking our teeth into this eighth principle is an opportunity for Tapestry to really do something different, to change, to deepen, to journey towards spiritual wholeness. And I'm excited about that possibility. Amen.